Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're exploring 61, contemporary American fiction from the 1950s to the present. It's an incredibly chaotic, totally fascinating journey through a period of massive social upheaval, where the very concept of what a novel should be was torn apart and stitched back together in completely new ways. Right out of the gate, we hit a massive problem. By 1961, American reality was moving so fast and becoming so completely absurd that writers felt they literally couldn't invent anything stranger than the daily news. Novelist Philip Roth hit the nail on the head when he said, "The actuality is continually undoing our talents." Think about it. As the nation grew into a global superpower with all its rapid social and political changes, authors were paralyzed. How on earth do you hold up a mirror to a society that's shifting right before your eyes? Especially when the morning paper reads like a sci-fi novel. To see how generations of authors solve this crisis of reality, we'll follow this roadmap. First, the crisis of reality. Second, mid-century literary pillars. Third, the experimental 60s. Fourth, postmodernism and paranoia. Fifth, expanding the American voice. And finally, a spotlight on the color purple. Let's get into it. Section 1. The crisis of reality. A world too fast to capture. The truth is, traditional 19th century realism just wasn't cutting it anymore. The world was simply moving too fast. Notice how each passing decade forced a radical shift in form. We start in the 1950s, a period sometimes called the tranquilized 50s, where authors leaned heavily on post-war naturalism. But as we push into the 1960s, counterculture and wild experimentation take over. Then the 1970s come along and completely shatter the mold with postmodernism, paving the way for the 1980s, where diversity and voices from the margins finally and rightfully take center stage. Section 2. Mid-century literary pillars. The greatest. Now, what's really interesting about the 1950s is how established titans tried to stretch those old literary forms to fit new post-World War II anxieties. We've got a great breakdown here. You had Norman Mailer, the ultimate literary provocateur, who blended intense journalism with fiction in works like The Armies of the Night, essentially treating history as a novel and the novel as history. Then there's Saul Bellow, exploring deep moral questions and inner identity against a rapidly modernizing society, especially in his masterpiece, Herzog. And of course, James Baldwin, a radical, absolutely vital voice. His novel, Another Country, boldly explored America's complex soul through intersections of race, identity, and love. They were all desperately trying to anchor the American soul in an increasingly turbulent world. Section 3. The experimental 60s. Breaking the novel. So as we transition into the 1960s, that turbulent world boiled over. Writers essentially realized they had to break the novel completely to make it work. One major solution? New journalism. Writers like Tom Wolfe and Truman Capote decided, hey, if reality is stranger than fiction, we should just write reality, but use the dramatic tools of a novelist. It totally blurred the boundaries. It replaced the traditional novel as the go-to way to chronicle contemporary experience, mainly because it allowed authors to dive deep into actual facts and current culture while keeping the reader completely hooked. As you can probably guess, this led to an absolute explosion of literary styles. The old rules, completely thrown out the window. A total disregard for the traditional canon allowed for a massive multiplicity of novelistic structures. You had documentary fiction mixing with high art, styles merging, and methods acquiring this deliberate sense of transiency. The literary world was splintering, and honestly, it was glorious. A perfect example of this 1960s mindset is Joseph Heller's Catch-22. Think of the main character, Yossarian. In a world defined by the horrific, mind-numbing bureaucracy of war, Yossarian's supposed insanity is actually his only logical survival tactic. To want to get out of combat duties, you must be sane, but if you're sane, you have to fight. It's the ultimate Catch-22, right? It perfectly metaphorizes the anti-establishment sentiment of the decade. The only sane response to an absurd reality is absurdity itself. Section 4. Postmodernism and paranoia, the 1970s. This anti-establishment sentiment eventually built into an era defined by deep postmodernism and, frankly, outright paranoia. The essential premise here became metafiction. These are novels that look right at you, the reader, and admit, hey, I'm just a book. They treat fictionality itself as the main subject. They completely abandon the old idea that art can faithfully mirror a chaotic society. In the postmodern view, claiming you can objectively document reality is the real fiction. So, think of the stark contrast this creates, where a traditional novel is a neat, linear mirror with a clear objective reality and characters who have distinct, obvious functions. The postmodern novel is a shattered, fragmented puzzle. Time is distorted. Reality is entirely subjective or blurred. The author might even drop into the story just to mess with you. It's a highly interactive, demanding form of reading. Authors like Kurt Vonnegut and Thomas Pynchon were the pioneers guiding readers through this chaotic maze. In Slaughterhouse-Five, Vonnegut uses his character Billy Pilgrim, who has become unstuck in time, to process the immense trauma of World War II. He experiences all times at once, a concept he learns from aliens called Trophomedorians. I mean, wow, right? Then you have Thomas Pynchon, who practically invented the mega-novel. His books, especially Gravity's Rainbow, are massive, paranoid conspiracies filled with hyper-technological landscapes, like the terrifying arc of the V-2 rocket. They force the reader to decode a world that might actually be entirely meaningless, which, if you've ever tried to read Gravity's Rainbow, is exactly how it feels. Looking at the trends of the era, we see a massive shift toward these complex structures. Metafictional elements and genre blending absolutely skyrocketed. The old distinction between highbrow literary fiction and genres like science fiction began to disappear entirely, as writers grabbed whatever tools were necessary to cope with the era's absurdity. Section 5. Expanding the American Voice. The 1980s and 90s. So, how did the literary world ultimately resolve this ongoing crisis? Well, they changed not just how the story was told, but who was telling it. The American canon exploded with diversity. We saw a massive surge in published female authors. There was a huge rise in ethnic diversity, bringing Black, Jewish, and Hispanic voices from the margins straight to the center of the narrative. Gay fiction began emerging into the mainstream. We also saw a movement called dirty realism, championed by writers like Raymond Carver, which stripped away all the extravagance and focused on the gritty, unadorned lives of the working class. Ultimately, literature became this incredibly powerful tool for re-examining history through previously silenced voices. Section 6. Spotlight. The color purple. Reclaiming the narrative. To really ground this massive shift, let's zoom in on a highly specific, emotional anchor from this era, Alice Walker's undeniable masterpiece, The Color Purple. It's a perfect example of the micro and the macro. On one hand, you have the intimate, solitary book of letters, representing the deeply personal core of Walker's epistolary novel. On the other hand, you have the vast, multicolored bookshelf. Walker's intimate story fundamentally reshaped the broader, diverse bookshelf of American fiction, basically forcing the canon to make room for entirely new perspectives. Through a profound womanist perspective, Walker uses this letter-writing structure to show a marginalized character, Celie, literally writing her own identity into existence. Celie writes letters to God and later to her sister, navigating a world where she is doubly segregated due to her race and gender. It's a brilliant, powerful reclamation of voice against extreme physical and psychological abuse, ultimately leading to a beautiful transformation rooted in self-realization and community. It proves without a doubt that fiction can be an act of profound survival. Which brings us right back to Philip Roth's warning from the very beginning. We see that while reality never actually stopped being chaotic, American literature survived. In fact, it didn't just survive, it thrived. It thrived by relentlessly diversifying both its structural forms and its storytellers. When the old mirror broke, writers picked up the shards and showed us perspectives we had never, ever seen before. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. As our modern world becomes even more overwhelming, shaped by rapid digital technology, endless social media feeds, and global interconnectedness, how will the next generation of writers rebuild the novel? If the mid-century writers had to invent metafiction to deal with the Cold War, what incredible, mind-bending literary inventions are waiting just around the corner for us today? Thanks so much for exploring this with me.